The calm before the storm. Clara Jenkins had always been a woman of habit. At 67, she'd built a life that was as peaceful as it was predictable, content with the simplicity of her daily routines. Each evening, just after 10 p.m., she would leash her German Shepherd, Baxter, and step outside into the cool night air. Their walks had become a treasured ritual, a quiet time for the two of them to unwind after the day's demands. There was a certain peace that came with the gentle rhythm of her footsteps and the comforting sound of Baxter's paws patting softly on the pavement beside her. The neighborhood she called home was tucked away on the outskirts of the city, far from the noise and chaos of downtown. It was the kind of place where the only sounds you'd hear were the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The houses were spread out generously, each yard well kept, and the streets, for the most part, were empty at night. Clara had always felt safe here, surrounded by familiar faces and the calm assurance that no one would disturb her peace. But on this particular night, something felt different. Clara couldn't quite place it at first, but there was a subtle tension in the air, a shift that made her pause for a moment before stepping outside. It wasn't fear. Clara had lived long enough to know that fear was often a product of the unknown. No, it was something more elusive. Something that made her stomach tighten and her senses heighten, as though she were walking into an unknown situation without realizing it. Baxter, as if sensing the same unease, walked closer to her side, his large frame brushing against her leg. It was a small gesture, but it was one that told Clara he felt the change in the air too. She glanced down at him and smiled softly. Baxter wasn't just a pet to her, he was a constant companion, a faithful friend, and more importantly, he was her protector. There was a history to Baxter that few people knew. He wasn't just a dog with a few basic tricks up his sleeve. He was a retired police K-9, one of the best. After years of working the streets, sniffing out drugs and helping apprehend criminals, Baxter had retired due to an injury. Clara had been lucky enough to take him in after his service ended. They made an unlikely pair, her, a quiet woman with a gentle demeanor, and him, a former officer with a fierce protective instinct. But tonight, as they walked through the empty street, Clara had no way of knowing that the peaceful evening she had so often taken for granted was about to be shattered. As they rounded the corner onto a more dimly lit street, Clara noticed a small group of men standing under the flickering glow of a streetlight. Their figures were shrouded in shadow, but there was something about the way they were huddled together that immediately set Clara's instincts on edge. It wasn't the way they stood. It was the way they moved, the way their body language seemed to suggest that they were waiting for something. And from the look of it, it wasn't the kind of waiting that suggested a friendly greeting. Baxter's ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. The sound was barely audible, but it carried with it a warning, a signal that Clara knew well. Baxter wasn't just growling because of the men's presence, he was warning them, telling them that they had crossed into his territory. Clara placed a hand gently on his back, trying to calm him, but she knew better than to ignore his instincts. Baxter was a dog that had been trained to detect danger. He could sense things that Clara couldn't, things she wasn't trained to see. As they drew closer, one of the men turned to look at them, his eyes briefly locking with Clara's. He raised an eyebrow, as though noticing the large dog by her side for the first time. A smirk spread across his face, and he nudged one of his companions. "Hey, look at that," he said, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "Grandma's out for a walk with her big bad wolf." The other two men laughed, their voices sharp and cruel, echoing in the night air. "Yeah, maybe she's training him to fetch her groceries," one of them said, and the sound of their laughter sent a chill down Clara's spine. Baxter, still walking beside her, responded to their jeers with a low, rumbling growl. His body was tense, and he took a few steps closer to Clara, positioning himself between her and the men as if to shield her from their gaze. The men didn't seem to notice the subtle warning. Instead, they kept coming closer, their movements slow and deliberate, almost as if they were testing Clara and her dog. Clara's heart began to race, but she steadied herself. She wasn't a young woman anymore, and she'd lived enough life to know how to deal with difficult situations. Still, she felt a small knot of anxiety twist in her stomach. It wasn't just their words, it was the look in their eyes. There was a certain gleam of malice there, something that told her they weren't just trying to intimidate her, they were sizing her up. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. Baxter growled louder now, a deep, throaty sound that vibrated through the night air. Clara could feel the power in that growl, the authority behind it. Baxter wasn't just protecting her, he was making it clear that this was his territory, and any threat to his person or his owner would be met with force. The tallest of the three men stepped forward, his smirk widening into something more menacing. He held up his hands in mock innocence. "Relax, lady," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We're just saying hello. No need for the guard dog act." Clara didn't respond. She kept her eyes fixed on the men, her hand gripping Baxter's leash tightly. She didn't need to speak, Baxter was already doing the talking for her. But the tension in the air thickened. Baxter's growl deepened, rising into a full bark, sharp, clear, and commanding. It was the kind of bark that sent a message. Clara's eyes widened as she realized that the men hadn't just been making idle jokes, they were getting closer, and their intentions had shifted. The tallest man, the one who had spoken, reached into his pocket, and for the first time, Clara saw the glint of metal in his hand. Her breath hitched. The object was small, shiny, and unmistakably dangerous. A knife. Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she refused to show fear. She stood her ground, holding Baxter's leash with all the strength she could muster. Baxter's growl intensified, and his body stiffened. He had seen it too. He knew what was at stake. "Don't come any closer," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady, given the circumstances. "My dog doesn't take kindly to threats." But the man didn't stop. He took another step toward them, the knife gleaming ominously in the low light. "We'll see about that, Grandma," he sneered, raising the knife as though it were some sort of challenge. "You and your mutt don't scare me." But what they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly guessed, was that Baxter wasn't just any dog. He wasn't some untrained, run-of-the-mill pet. Baxter was a retired police K-9, a dog who had been trained for situations like this. And he was ready to show them just how dangerous he could be. As the man lunged forward with the knife raised high, Clara's voice rang out, "Baxter, now." The world seemed to freeze as Baxter sprang into action. His movements were swift, fluid, and precise, like a predator with a single goal, to protect. The showdown in the streets. The streets were eerily silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves stirred by the wind. As Clara stood firm, her heart thudded in her chest, but her resolve never wavered. She was ready. Baxter, her loyal companion, had lived through situations that most ordinary dogs could never fathom, and Clara knew that the bond they shared was far beyond that of just owner and pet, it was a relationship built on trust, respect, and protection. Baxter had been trained for moments like this, and this night, under the dim glow of the streetlights, was his time to shine. Clara's eyes never left the men as they advanced, each step they took only heightening the tension in the air. The man with the knife, the one who had spoken so confidently, was now only a few paces away. His smug grin was still plastered on his face, but Clara could see the flickers of doubt in his eyes. He wasn't sure if he was making a mistake, but in his mind, the knife in his hand was a ticket to control. The other two men, one tall and one short, flanked him on either side, their expressions ranging from nervous curiosity to full-blown fear. They hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly, and they definitely hadn't anticipated the sudden fierceness of the dog before them. Baxter's growl grew louder, the sound rolling from deep within his chest like distant thunder, shaking the still night. His body was rigid, alert, and ready to act. He was no longer just a pet, he was a protector, and his focus was razor-sharp. The air seemed to vibrate with his energy, and even Clara could feel the power emanating from him. The man with the knife, clearly sensing that the situation was shifting, raised the blade higher, his eyes narrowing as he focused on Baxter. "Come on, mutt," he sneered. "I'll show you who's boss." Clara's grip on the leash tightened, her fingers aching from the pressure. She steadied herself, glancing down at Baxter. There was no fear in his eyes, just pure determination. She knew then that no matter what happened next, he would do his job. He would protect her, no matter the cost. Suddenly, the man lunged forward, the knife gleaming under the streetlight. For a brief moment, time seemed to stretch out, the world holding its breath. But then Baxter moved, faster than anyone could have anticipated. In one fluid motion, Baxter was in the air, his powerful muscles propelling him forward with terrifying speed. The man's eyes widened in shock as Baxter's jaws snapped shut around his arm with an explosive force. The blade fell from his grasp, clattering to the pavement with a sickening metallic sound. The man screamed, his voice high and panicked as he tried to shake Baxter off. But Baxter held firm, his teeth sinking deeper into the man's flesh with unrelenting precision. The man stumbled backward, unable to regain his balance, his cries growing more desperate with every passing second. "Get this dog off me," the man howled, his face contorted in pain as he struggled to free himself. The other two men froze, their bravado faltering as they watched their companion writhe in agony. It had happened so quickly, one moment, they thought they were in control, and the next, they were faced with a situation they had no idea how to handle. The short man, who had remained quiet up until now, took an unsteady step backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell is wrong with this dog?" he stammered, his voice a mixture of fear and confusion. The taller man, recovering from his initial shock, stepped forward. "We've got to take him down," he barked, his voice now tinged with panic. He reached for a piece of wood that had been discarded on the ground nearby, gripping it with both hands. His eyes were frantic, and for the first time, the cocky attitude that had marked their earlier confrontation was gone, replaced by a deep, instinctual fear. Clara's pulse quickened as the two men began to move closer, their faces twisted in anger and desperation. They were no longer thinking clearly, they were acting purely out of fear. Fear of the dog. Fear of the situation they had unwittingly found themselves in. But Baxter wasn't afraid. He wasn't like any dog they had ever encountered. He was trained to face threats head-on, to protect his handler at all costs. As the taller man raised the makeshift weapon, Clara's voice cut through the tension. "Baxter, stay focused," she commanded, her tone low but firm. It was the kind of command that Baxter understood instinctively, a reminder to stay on task, to ignore the distractions, and to neutralize the threat. Baxter didn't flinch. He had been in worse situations, and his training kicked in immediately. With a deep, guttural growl, he pivoted to face the taller man, who had raised the wooden stick above his head as though it were a club. The man swung it toward Baxter, but Baxter was already moving, his body a blur of motion. With a swift, calculated move, Baxter sidestepped the swing, his agility defying belief. He was like a shadow, dodging the strike with the precision of a highly trained officer. The man with the stick lost his balance for a brief moment, his swing going wide. In that split second, Baxter launched himself forward, knocking the man to the ground with the sheer force of his attack. The man hit the pavement with a loud thud, the wooden stick falling from his hands and rolling into the gutter. He let out a grunt of pain, stunned by the speed and power of the dog's strike. He tried to scramble to his feet, but Baxter was already on top of him, pinning him down with a firm grip on his arm. Clara's heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold, but she kept her focus. She knew Baxter had this under control. He wasn't just fighting back, he was neutralizing the threat, just like he had been trained to do. The third man, the one who had been hesitant from the beginning, stood frozen in place, his hands raised as if to shield himself. His eyes flicked nervously between Baxter and his friends, who were now both on the ground, one writhing in pain and the other trapped beneath the German shepherd's powerful form. This dog is crazy," the third man shouted, his voice trembling as he looked for an escape. Clara's voice was steady as she spoke, her grip on the leash unshaken. "That dog isn't crazy. He's trained." Her words rang out with a quiet authority. "And right now, he's doing his job." The man's eyes widened in panic, and without another word, he turned and bolted, running down the street as fast as he could. The two men on the ground, however, weren't so lucky. The one whose arm had been clamped in Baxter's powerful jaws was still struggling to break free, but the pain was too much. His movements were slow, sluggish, and his attempts to get away were futile. "You don't get to walk away from this," Clara said, her voice icy now. She had seen enough to know that these men weren't just misguided, they were a real threat, and she couldn't afford to let them think that their actions were without consequences. Baxter shifted his weight, his grip on the man tightening just enough to remind him who was in control. The man screamed again, but Baxter wasn't letting go, not yet. The struggle between man and dog felt like it was stretching on forever, but in reality, it had only been moments. Finally, Clara took a step forward. "Baxter, release," she commanded calmly, and just like that, the dog's jaws relaxed, releasing the man's arm. The man rolled away quickly, clutching his injured arm to his chest as he scrambled to get up. He wasn't sure if he was more afraid of Baxter or of the woman standing beside him. Clara didn't give them the chance to recover. She reached for her phone, dialing the police as she stood over them. Her voice was calm and steady as she spoke into the receiver, but there was no mistaking the fire in her eyes. "This is Clara Jenkins," she said, her voice cutting through the night air. "I'm calling to report an attempted assault. I've been attacked by 3 men, but I'm safe. One of them is injured, and the others are, well, they're learning a very valuable lesson right now." A lesson learned. The moment Clara finished her call with the police, the air seemed to settle. The danger wasn't over, but it had shifted from immediate threat to control. Baxter, still standing vigilant, remained a stark figure of calm authority in the middle of the street. His eyes never strayed from the 2 men who were slowly starting to gather themselves, grimacing in pain but clearly reluctant to move. The third man who had fled was long gone, his footsteps echoing in the distance, but Clara knew he wouldn't be far. Fear, after all, has a way of pushing people into corners they're not ready to face. As she stood there, the dark shadows of the night wrapping around her, Clara's mind raced with what had just happened. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, but the sharpness of the event was beginning to settle into something deeper. Her body relaxed, though her senses remained heightened, sharp and attuned to every movement around her. She took a steadying breath, her eyes flicking from the men back to Baxter, who was now sitting in a defensive stance, his ears perked, watching intently. The man who had been the most aggressive, the one with the knife, was still lying on the pavement, cradling his injured arm. His face was twisted in pain, and Clara could see the mixture of disbelief and fear in his wide eyes. The other man, the one with the piece of wood, was also getting to his feet slowly, his posture now less threatening, more hesitant. He kept glancing between Clara and Baxter, clearly reassessing his previous bravado. Clara's gaze was firm, unwavering. She wasn't going to let them off the hook easily. No matter how injured they were, no matter how much they regretted their decisions in the heat of the moment, the fact remained that they had come at her with intent to harm. And she wasn't the type to back down. "Well," Clara said, her voice low but steady, "this is where you find out what happens when you pick the wrong person to target." The man with the knife tried to stand, his body trembling, but he stopped halfway up, cringing from the pain. He cast a sideways glance at his companion, then back to Clara. His eyes shifted toward the dog again, and Clara could almost see the wheels turning in his head. The sharpness of his thoughts was apparent, but the real question was whether or not he'd learned anything from the experience. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse from fear and pain. "Look, lady, we didn't mean no harm," he said, his words coming out as a mixture of pleading and annoyance. "We were just messing around. Your dog's crazy, look at him. He just attacked me for no reason." Clara narrowed her eyes, the cool detachment of the night wrapping around her like armor. "Your intentions were clear," she said, her tone matter of fact. "You came after me and my dog, thinking you could intimidate us. But it turns out, you weren't the ones in control." The man shifted uncomfortably, but he said nothing more. He glanced at the other man, whose face was now set in a scowl. The man with the wood was still standing, though his posture had softened. He seemed to be unsure of what to do next, and Clara realized that their earlier confidence was now shattered. They hadn't expected to encounter a woman who was prepared to fight back, and certainly not one with a dog as formidable as Baxter. The seconds dragged on, the tension in the air growing thicker with every passing moment. Clara's grip on Baxter's leash remained firm, but she was no longer filled with panic. Instead, there was something more calm, more purposeful in her movements. She knew the situation was far from over, there were still consequences to be faced, decisions to be made, and lessons to be learned. "Why don't you take a moment to think about how lucky you are?" Clara said to them, her voice carrying the weight of what she had just lived through. She gestured toward Baxter, who sat silently by her side. "This dog didn't have to stop. He could have torn you apart." The man with the knife grimaced, rubbing his arm as though he could erase the memory of Baxter's jaws clamping down. He looked up at Clara, finally meeting her gaze fully. Yeah, I get it," he muttered under his breath. "You've got a big dog. That's cute." Clara wasn't impressed by his dismissal. "It's not about his size," she replied evenly. "It's about the fact that he was trained for situations like this. He's not just a dog, he's a partner, and he does his job. You didn't give him a choice." At that moment, the distant sound of sirens began to fill the air. Clara exhaled, the rush of emotions finally beginning to settle. The police were on their way, and she wasn't about to let these men walk away without facing the consequences of their actions. But as the sirens grew louder, Clara's mind wandered back to the events of the night. What had it really been? Was it about the men underestimating her? Or had it been about the power of taking control when things seemed out of control? She wasn't sure. But she did know one thing for sure, this was more than just a street confrontation. This was a reminder of the power of preparedness, the strength in having someone, or something, who would back you up when it mattered most. The men who had come for her now seemed to shrink in the presence of the approaching police. The cocky, aggressive demeanor they had shown only moments earlier was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of regret. The man with the knife shifted uncomfortably, eyeing the retreating figure of the man who had fled. He clearly wanted to bolt as well, but there was no escape now. They had made their move, and there was no backing out. Clara was about to speak again when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps from around the corner. The police had arrived. 2 officers emerged, their faces serious, and when they saw the scene in front of them, they wasted no time assessing the situation. One of the officers, a woman in her late 30s, glanced at Clara first, taking in the calmness in her stance. Then her gaze moved to the 2 men, still on the ground. The officer spoke first, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Her eyes flicked to Clara's dog, who was still sitting protectively by her side. Baxter's presence seemed to fill the space, adding a weight to the scene that the officers didn't need to question. Clara nodded toward the 2 men, her voice cool but firm. "They attacked me," she said. "They thought I was an easy target. But Baxter," she patted his head gently, "had other plans." The officers nodded, their expressions unreadable as they approached the men on the ground. One officer took a brief statement from Clara, while the other began checking on the 2 men. It didn't take long for the officers to understand the full scope of what had happened. The men, seeing their situation deteriorate, were quickly read their rights. As the officers processed them, Clara stood silently by, Baxter at her side. She wasn't angry, not anymore. Instead, she felt something else, something quieter. It was a satisfaction in knowing that sometimes, standing your ground was the most powerful thing you could do. And it was a reminder that you never really knew what someone, or something, was capable of until they were pushed to the limit. The two men were eventually handcuffed and led toward the police car, their heads hung low in defeat. The third man who had run away hadn't come back, and Clara knew that his fear would probably linger far longer than the events of tonight. As Clara walked back home with Baxter by her side, the night didn't seem so dark anymore. There was a strange peace that had settled over her, one that came from knowing she had been prepared, from knowing that she had stood her ground. And as she slipped inside her house, closing the door behind her, she looked down at Baxter with a grateful smile. He had done his job. Now, it was time to rest. They had both earned it. The ripple effect. The night had passed without incident, but Clara's mind couldn't rest. Her thoughts kept returning to the events of the evening, replaying every moment, every movement. Though the police had taken control, and the men who had dared to threaten her were now under arrest, Clara couldn't help but think of what might have happened if Baxter hadn't been by her side. What if she had been alone? What if she hadn't noticed the subtle tension in the air, the way the men had moved together under the flickering streetlight, ready to pounce? The weight of those questions hung in the air like a fog, clouding her thoughts as she sat in her quiet living room, Baxter curled up at her feet. It was the middle of the morning when the phone rang. Clara, who had been in a haze since the previous night, answered it with a sharp intake of breath, still unsure if she was truly awake. But the voice on the other end was familiar. It was Officer Peters, the woman who had arrived at the scene last night. "Mrs. Jenkins, I wanted to check in and make sure everything was okay," Officer Peters said, her voice calm but with a hint of concern. "I know it was a traumatic event, and I wanted to see if you needed anything or if you had any questions about the next steps." Clara's fingers tightened on the phone, and for a moment, she just stared out the window, watching the early morning light spill over the neighborhood. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous evening. She had been so focused on defending herself and protecting Baxter that she hadn't thought much about the emotional aftermath. "I'm all right, thank you for checking in," Clara said after a pause, her voice steady but tired. "Baxter and I are both fine. But it's just, I keep thinking about what happened. I've lived in this neighborhood for decades, and something like this never crossed my mind. It feels like everything changed in an instant." "I understand, Mrs. Jenkins," Officer Peters replied sympathetically. "This type of thing can really shake a person, especially in a quiet area like yours. It's not something we expect to happen. But I want to assure you that we're taking it very seriously. The men involved are being processed, and there will be charges. You did the right thing, standing your ground." Clara nodded, though she knew Officer Peters couldn't see it. The words didn't entirely ease the ache in her chest, the unsettling feeling that her sense of safety had been compromised. It wasn't just about what happened last night, it was the fact that it could have happened at all. The idea that anyone could feel entitled to harm her, to threaten her simply because she was an older woman walking her dog, stirred something deep inside of her. It reminded her that, no matter how calm and secure things seemed, there were always people who saw vulnerability as an opportunity, not as a sign of respect. "Thank you," Clara said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "I'll be all right. But if there's anything else you need, please let me know." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Officer Peters spoke again, her tone turning more reflective. "You know, I've been thinking about last night, about what you said to those men. About standing your ground. I don't think they knew who they were messing with." Clara chuckled softly, feeling a hint of pride stir inside her. "They certainly found out, didn't they?" "They did," Officer Peters said with a small laugh. "You were more than just a lady with a dog. You were someone who knew how to take charge of the situation. I hope they learn from this." Clara didn't know if the men would ever learn, but she was certain they would remember her face, and Baxter's, for a long time. And maybe that was the most powerful thing of all, the idea that, sometimes, the best lesson came from standing up for yourself when everyone else expected you to be a victim. It was a powerful thing, the knowledge that she had the strength to take control of a situation and stop something before it could spiral out of control. As she hung up the phone, Clara felt a flicker of hope. Despite the fear and uncertainty that had gripped her the night before, she was starting to feel a renewed sense of strength. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor. She could handle whatever came her way, just as she had done last night. It wasn't just the police and Officer Peters who were reaching out. Clara received phone calls, messages, and even a few visits from neighbors she hadn't spoken to much in the past. It seemed that the community was rallying behind her, drawn together by the understanding that what had happened to Clara could have happened to anyone. A woman in her 60s, out for a simple walk with her dog, wasn't supposed to be targeted for violence, and yet, the fact that it had happened made everyone pause and think about their own safety and the fragility of peace. One neighbor, Mrs. Lawson, who lived a few houses down, came by with a bouquet of flowers. Mrs. Lawson was a retired schoolteacher who had always kept to herself, preferring the quiet of her home and her garden. Clara had never had much reason to speak with her beyond the occasional wave over the fence, but that day, Mrs. Lawson knocked on her door, and when Clara opened it, she was holding a small vase of lilies. "I just wanted to say that I'm so sorry this happened to you," Mrs. Lawson said, her voice soft and sincere. "You don't deserve that. No one does. But I've heard about what happened, and I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You stood your ground, and I think we all can learn something from that." Clara was taken aback for a moment, but she quickly smiled, accepting the flowers with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Lawson," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought something like this would happen around here. But I'm glad I could show that sometimes, standing your ground is the best thing you can do." The simple gesture meant more to Clara than she realized. It wasn't just the flowers. It was the fact that the community had come together, not just in pity, but in solidarity. They had seen what happened, and instead of turning away, they reached out. They were offering support, offering empathy. And Clara realized then that, while the world wasn't always kind, there were people who understood the importance of standing up, even when it felt uncomfortable. It didn't take long before other neighbors began stopping by, dropping off baked goods or offering a quick word of encouragement. Everyone knew the story now, the woman who had stood up to 3 men in the dark of night, with the help of her loyal, retired police dog. It was a story that resonated, and Clara found herself more connected to her community than ever before. It felt good to know that others saw her not just as a vulnerable old woman, but as a woman who had the courage to fight back. As the days passed, the men who had attacked her remained in custody, facing charges that could change the course of their lives forever. Clara was not interested in seeking vengeance, but she understood the importance of justice. They had made a dangerous decision, and now they would have to face the consequences. But as she sat on her porch with Baxter by her side, watching the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, Clara knew that the real victory wasn't just in the legal outcome of the situation, it was in the sense of empowerment that had bloomed from the ashes of fear. The ripple effect of that night, the way it had affected the men, her neighbors, and even Clara herself, would last long after the police had left, long after the story was told. It had changed something fundamental in her. And she realized that, sometimes, the greatest lesson wasn't about how you defend yourself, it was about how you use your strength to inspire others to do the same. The unseen power of community. The days following the attack had been a blur of phone calls, messages, and visits from well-meaning neighbors who sought to offer their support. Clara had never been the type to seek attention, but the community's response to what had happened to her was overwhelming. What had started as a terrifying ordeal had evolved into something far more profound, a reminder of the strength found in unity, in people who stood together, even in the face of violence. The support was everywhere. People in her neighborhood who had once merely nodded at her from across the street or exchanged polite greetings now felt like family. She would receive calls from folks she barely knew, just checking in to make sure she was okay, to express how much her bravery had inspired them. Some even went so far as to walk with her during her evening walks with Baxter, ensuring she wouldn't feel alone or unsafe. It was as if her act of courage had awakened something in the community, an understanding that their safety, their peace, depended on looking out for one another. But it wasn't just the small gestures that made Clara feel seen, it was the way people started to change. Those who had once been passive, who had watched injustice unfold around them but never intervened, were now finding their voices. It was as if her bravery had stirred a new sense of accountability in the neighborhood. People were beginning to look out for one another, taking note of suspicious behavior and reporting it to the authorities without hesitation. And that, Clara realized, was the real power of community. One day, as she was sitting on her porch with Baxter, sipping tea, Mrs. Lawson, the retired schoolteacher, came over again. This time, her visit wasn't just a quick hello or an offering of flowers, it was something deeper. "You know, Clara," Mrs. Lawson began, sitting down beside her, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. And I realize now that I've been living in this neighborhood for years, and I've never really taken the time to get involved. I've always kept to myself, thinking I didn't need to worry about what was happening around me. But after hearing about what happened to you, I realize that I can't keep ignoring things. I need to pay more attention. We all do." Clara listened intently, her heart swelling with gratitude for Mrs. Lawson's words. The schoolteacher had always been quiet, a woman who kept her distance from the bustle of the neighborhood. But now, she was acknowledging the power she held, the power to be more than just a passive observer. "You don't have to be the one to fight, but you can stand up," Clara replied, her voice calm but firm. "Sometimes, just speaking up is all it takes. Let others know you won't stand for it, that you won't let things like this happen again. Because the more we stand up, the harder it is for these things to take root." Mrs. Lawson nodded thoughtfully, her eyes bright with determination. "You're right. I've been blind to it all. But now, I see. And I won't let fear stop me from speaking out." Clara smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. She wasn't just standing her ground for herself, she was setting an example for others, showing them that courage didn't have to be loud or aggressive. It could be quiet, resolute, and firm. It was the quiet voices of those who spoke out, of those who decided enough was enough, that would create lasting change. As the weeks passed, Clara found herself growing more connected to her neighbors than she had ever been. The sense of unity was palpable. People were talking more, sharing their concerns, and discussing ways to improve the neighborhood. The streets, once filled with hushed whispers and unspoken tensions, now felt alive with a sense of collaboration. It was clear that the ripple effect of what had happened to her had created something bigger than she could have imagined, a sense of solidarity that no one could ignore. One afternoon, while Clara and Baxter were on their walk, they encountered a group of local residents who had gathered at the park near the neighborhood entrance. Clara had seen them before, parents with their children, older couples walking their dogs, and younger professionals jogging or riding their bikes, but today, there was something different in the air. There was an energy, a kind of collective purpose, as if everyone was ready to take action. She stopped by the group, curious about the change. "Oh, Clara," one of the women, Sarah, called out. "We've been talking about ways to keep the neighborhood safe. We've had some meetings, and we're thinking of starting a neighborhood watch program. After everything that happened to you, we realized that we need to look out for each other more. It's not just about physical safety, but about feeling like we're a community again." Clara's heart swelled as she heard Sarah's words. A neighborhood watch program, this was the change she had hoped for. It was the kind of response that demonstrated a shift in collective consciousness. People weren't just reacting out of fear or anger anymore, they were taking responsibility. They were coming together to protect one another, to ensure that no one else would have to go through what she had. That sounds like a great idea, Clara said, her voice filled with pride. I'm so glad to see everyone taking action. This is the way forward. We all need to stand together, look out for each other. And we can't do that if we stay isolated. We need to be a team. The group nodded in agreement, and plans began to take shape. The meetings grew larger, the discussions more organized. What had once been a simple, quiet neighborhood was now evolving into a community of people who were determined to be vigilant, to care for one another, and to ensure that their peace was not easily disturbed. Clara felt a sense of purpose wash over her. What she had started with her quiet act of bravery had ignited a movement. It wasn't just about one woman standing up to three men, it was about an entire neighborhood waking up to the power they held if they chose to act together. As Clara continued to take her walks with Baxter, she noticed something else. It wasn't just the adults who had changed, it was the children too. No longer was she just the older woman walking her big dog, now, she was someone they looked up to. She'd become an example of strength, resilience, and community, a role model in their eyes. On more than one occasion, she was stopped by young families who wanted to thank her, to tell her how proud they were of her. One young mother, with her toddler in tow, stopped Clara on her walk one day. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her voice full of gratitude. "My son is starting school soon, and I've been teaching him about bravery and standing up for what's right. You're the example I've been using. I tell him about you and your dog, and I hope that he grows up to be just as brave." Clara was taken aback by the woman's words, unsure of what to say at first. But then, with a soft smile, she replied, "It's not about being brave all the time. It's about doing what needs to be done when it counts. And I believe anyone can do that, even if they don't think they can." The young mother nodded, and Clara saw the genuine admiration in her eyes. It was moments like these unexpected reminders of how her actions were touching lives in ways she never could have anticipated, that kept her going. It wasn't just about protecting herself, it was about lighting the way for others to do the same. The neighborhood, once quiet and divided, was now buzzing with energy. People were coming together, organizing, and helping each other in ways they hadn't before. And in the midst of it all, Clara Jenkins, with her loyal police dog, Baxter, was standing as a symbol of the quiet strength that could turn the tide, one act of courage at a time. The ripple effect of that night had only just begun. The lasting legacy of courage. Months had passed since that fateful night when Clara Jenkins and her retired police dog, Baxter, had stood their ground against three would-be attackers. The physical and emotional scars from the encounter had faded, but the lessons learned and the changes sparked in the community were enduring. Clara had never intended for her quiet, peaceful evening walk to become the catalyst for such a profound transformation, but sometimes, the simplest acts of courage could trigger a ripple effect that spread far beyond what anyone could foresee. Now, as Clara sat in her favorite chair by the window, watching the evening sky shift from blue to purple, she reflected on everything that had happened since. Baxter lay at her feet, his eyes half closed, content, as if he too had become accustomed to the new rhythm of their lives. The streetlights outside flickered to life, and she could hear the sounds of children laughing in the distance, a familiar and comforting sound. This, she thought, was the neighborhood she had always wanted, a place where safety wasn't taken for granted, where community was more than just a word, and where people cared enough about one another to act when it mattered most. It hadn't been an easy journey. There had been days when Clara doubted if things would ever return to normal, when the weight of the world seemed too heavy to bear. The media coverage had been overwhelming, and the eyes of the entire neighborhood had been on her. Some people had been supportive, others had criticized her for what they saw as a violent response to what was, in their eyes, a simple mugging attempt. But Clara knew the truth. It wasn't about violence, it was about protecting herself, her dog, and her home. It was about standing up for the dignity and safety of others, too, knowing that sometimes the strongest defense was the quietest one. The new Neighborhood Watch program had been a major success. In fact, it had quickly become one of the most organized and efficient community initiatives in the area. Meetings were held regularly, and residents from all walks of life, young professionals, parents, retirees, participated. They would discuss potential security issues, share updates on any suspicious activity, and most importantly, make sure no one felt isolated or unsafe. Even though it had begun as a direct response to the attack on Clara, the Watch program quickly took on a life of its own, growing into something far larger than anyone had initially anticipated. It was a true community effort, and Clara was proud to see how everyone had come together to make it a success. What Clara hadn't expected, though, was how the neighborhood's transformation would ripple outward. Word of the community's newfound unity and vigilance had spread to surrounding areas, inspiring other neighborhoods to start their own programs. What had started as a local initiative became part of a larger movement, one that championed the idea that a neighborhood's strength didn't come from the size of its homes or the wealth of its residents, but from the solidarity, the willingness to protect one another, and the courage to stand up when it mattered most. One morning, as Clara was walking Baxter around the block, she ran into Officer Daniels, the local cop who had responded to the incident that night. He was a regular presence in the neighborhood now, not just because of his duties, but because he had taken it upon himself to be part of the community's efforts. As they exchanged pleasantries, Officer Daniels leaned in and lowered his voice slightly. "Clara," he said, his expression serious but warm, "I wanted to let you know something. The story of what happened that night, it's been used as part of the training for new recruits at the police academy." Clara blinked, surprised. "Training? What for?" "Mostly for de-escalation and community engagement," Officer Daniels explained. "It's about teaching them that every situation is different, that sometimes, the threat isn't obvious. But more importantly, it's about showing them the power of community. How a simple act of courage, like standing your ground, can change everything." Clara was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. It wasn't often she was made aware of how far-reaching her actions had been. She had never set out to be an example to anyone, but the reality was that her courage had become a teaching tool, a story that now served as an inspiration for law enforcement officers who would go on to protect others. "Thank you for telling me that," Clara said finally. "I didn't realize it was making that kind of impact." Officer Daniels smiled. "It's more than just about what you did that night, Clara. It's about the way you've shown everyone that standing up isn't just about fighting, it's about knowing when to act, and when to trust those around you. You've taught us all something." It was humbling for Clara to hear that her actions had made such an impact, but it also made her reflect on what had truly driven her that night. It hadn't been some grand sense of heroism, but rather the quiet knowledge that she was capable of doing what needed to be done to protect herself and her dog. She hadn't expected to be thrust into the spotlight, but she had learned that sometimes, standing up for what's right meant being willing to stand alone, no matter how hard that might seem at the time. As the weeks passed, Clara found that the changes in the neighborhood didn't just stop with increased vigilance and a stronger sense of community. There were deeper, more subtle shifts happening too. People who had once been divided by differences of race, class, or background were now coming together in ways they hadn't before. A shared commitment to safety, respect, and justice had allowed them to find common ground in unexpected ways. One afternoon, Clara sat down with her neighbor, Mrs. Lawson, the retired schoolteacher who had become one of her closest allies. Over tea, they discussed the changes they had seen, not just in their own lives, but in the lives of those around them. "You know, Clara," Mrs. Lawson said thoughtfully, "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. People are starting to open up to one another, to listen, to care. It's like everyone has been waiting for someone to lead the way, and now, they have. You've shown us all that the power to change things is in our hands, if we're brave enough to take it." Clara smiled softly, her heart full. "I never thought of myself as a leader. I was just trying to get through the night." "But you are a leader," Mrs. Lawson insisted. "And you've led us all to a place where we can finally see what's possible when we come together. We've got a long way to go, but we're on the right track." Clara felt a deep sense of fulfillment as she listened to Mrs. Lawson's words. It had been a long journey, but it had been worth every step. The challenges, the fear, the uncertainty, everything had led her to this point, where she could see the tangible impact of her courage. It was a feeling she hadn't expected, but one she had come to cherish deeply. As the years went by, Clara continued her walks with Baxter. The neighborhood that had once felt like an isolated corner of the world had transformed into a thriving, connected community. And every time she passed by someone who nodded in recognition or smiled at her, she knew that her decision to stand her ground that night had been the spark that ignited a lasting change.